Dorino Talaman, former property manager and Section 8 tenant of Mark Smith, told the jury his side of the truth about Mr. Smith as an employer and landlord. When all is said and done, the testimony of this poor blue-collar worker may very well have led to the jury returning a guilty verdict against Smith in his federal corruption trial. According to testimony and evidence witnesses prior to Talaman provided, Smith, Gura Management, and its board all understood it was a problem that Smith was renting units to Section 8 tenants and at the same time providing legal counsel to Gura, which administers the Section 8 federal funding. While Smith was legal counsel for Gura, he sold his apartments to Glenn Wong, his friend and co-defendant who died this year. Smith's attorney, Mike Phillips, told the jury at the start of the trial that the federal government does not have a shred of evidence his client committed a crime. The U.S. attorney is alleging the sale of the apartments to Wong simply was a scheme to cover up Smith's conflict. But no one has ever been able to testify to this until Talaman took the stand. Prosecutor Maravik David asked Mr. Talaman who his landlord was when he resided at the Smith's apartments. Mr. Talaman said,
"Mark Smith."
Later, an amendment to Mr. Talaman's Gura contract had to be signed, acknowledging the change of landlord from Mr. Smith to Glenn Wong. Ms. David asked Mr. Talaman who had signed the document on behalf of Mr. Wong. Mr. Talaman said,
"The mom of Mark Smith."
The signature on the amendment above Mr. Wong's name was that of Rosita Owens, Smith's mother, as Mr. Wong's power of attorney. Ms. David asked Mr. Talaman how he knew Miss Owens, to which he responded,
"I do work for her, for Mark Smith though."
He continued,
"Mark Smith sent me down to his mom's own place."
Ms. David asked if Mr. Talaman was aware his landlord, Mark Smith, was also Gura's legal counsel. Mr. Talaman confirmed that he knew he was Gura's attorney. Ms. David asked him how he became aware of that information, and he said,
"He told me."
When the change of landlord came about, Mr. Talaman said,
"Mark called me up, told me to distribute the flyers."
When asked what the flyers said, Mr. Talaman said,
"Something about change in landlord."
Ms. David asked if Mr. Smith said anything to him regarding the change of landlord. Mr. Talaman divulged,
"I remember him telling me that he's still the owner of the apartments though. It's just he has to change the name because of Gura's policy."
Mr. Talaman never wavered that,
"Bottom line, he's still the landlord. He's still the owner of the place though."
As a property manager, Mr. Talaman said his duties were
painting the house, bush cutting, cleaning the house, going down to do service for him.
Referring to Mr. Smith, Ms. David asked Mr. Talaman how he would pay his rent. Mr. Talaman explained,
"We switched favors. He told me I work for him. Mark Smith told me that."
Ms. David inquired if Mr. Talaman would do similar work for Glenn Wong once he became the landlord. Mr. Talaman told her,
"I never met Mr. Wong though. No, I didn't."
The prosecutor asked if there came a time in 2014 that Mr. Talaman was served papers for small claims action. Mr. Talaman recalled,
"I remember Mark Smith taking me to court."
Ms. David asked if Mr. Talaman was taken to court because of a promissory note for $1,700 he failed to pay in 2013 for rent on the apartment Glenn Wong was supposed to own, not Smith. Mr. Talaman answered,
"I don't recall, but I remember paying $500 when I went to court though."
During defense counsel's attempt at cross-examination, Mr. Phillips tried his best to get Mr. Talaman to acknowledge Mr. Wong as the person he agreed to pay on the promissory note. Mr. Phillips asked Mr. Talaman if he signed the document. Mr. Talaman responded,
"Yes, I did, but Mark Smith told me he's still the owner."
Mr. Phillips repeatedly asked the question, and Mr. Talaman maintained,
"There's no Glenn Wong. There's no Glenn Wong though. From my understanding, there's no Glenn Wong. My understanding is Mark Smith is the landlord."
Mr. Phillips referred to a document indicating Mr. Wong, represented by attorney Mark Smith, was suing Mr. Talaman for the money that was owed. Attorney Phillips asked Mr. Talaman if he could see Mr. Wong's name in the case against him. Mr. Talaman said,
"I see a name, but I did not see any Glenn Wong. I'm telling you there's no Glenn Wong though. I remember the case, but I never met the Glenn Wong."
Judge Ramona Manglotnia finally intervened.
The witness already answered that he remembers the case, Mr. Phillips.
To discredit the witness, Mr. Phillips resurrected charges that Mr. Talaman was never convicted of. Ms. David moved to strike the question, and Judge Manglotnia chided Mr. Phillips.
Mr. Phillips, you can accuse people of what they are charged with, and as we know, when people are charged, they're presumed innocent. What will be admissible is what the person is convicted with. So the objection is sustained to the extent you're representing what a person's been charged with.
The final attempt from defense to get the witness to acknowledge Mr. Wong was when Mr. Phillips asked Mr. Talaman if he ever told federal officials that he saw Glenn Wong standing near or by Mr. Smith. Mr. Talaman said,
No.
Mr. Phillips asked,
If any federal official said that it would be a lie?
Mr. Talaman said with finality.
Yes.
David Berger, a certified public accountant, also testified. Mr. Berger bought the so-called Smith apartments from Glenn Wong, Mr. Smith's deceased co-defendant. Prosecutor Maravik David asked if Mr. Berger had any association with another CPA by the name of Carvin Flynn, who conducted an audit of Gura. Mr. Berger explained,
Yes, Carvin is a 40% owner of BCM LLC.
Mr. Berger is a 60% owner of the firm on Guam called Berger Comer Magliari LLC, or BCM LLC. Prosecutor Maravik David asked Mr. Berger if he was aware of the Gura audit. Mr. Berger replied,
I am aware. I wasn't really directly involved in it.
Ms. David asked Mr. Berger if he ever had to disclose a conflict of interest with Gura because of the audit work Mr. Flynn was involved with. Mr. Berger said,
In our firm of Berger and Comer, we do not have any conflict of interest, and when we became BCM, I wouldn't have had any conflict of interest until I bought the apartments.
Ms. David asked Mr. Berger if he knew Mr. Smith. Mr. Berger replied,
We've never spoken.
Referring to the purchase contract for the Smith apartments, Ms. David asked who the seller was. Mr. Berger said,
It was Glenn Wong.
Ms. David asked, Did that surprise you? Mr. Berger answered,
It did. I did not know that Glenn Wong was going to be on the paperwork until I went to sign the paperwork.
When asked whose name he had expected to be on the paperwork, Mr. Berger said,
I expected Mark Smith.
He continued,
The property was introduced to me by a realtor as Mark Smith Apartments.
Ms. David probed Mr. Berger for specifics.
I had let Vic Regis know that I was interested in acquiring apartments in Guam.
Mr. Berger explained to Ms. David that
Vic called me and said, Hey, there's a property for sale. Would you be interested? And I said, Well, tell me what it is. Well, there's 8 apartments and a 5-bedroom house right next to each other. Do you want to go look at it? So Vic and I went there, and he showed me 2 units. We went inside, and Vic said, These are Mark Smith's apartments. He's selling them. We have a Korean gentleman that's offered $750,000, and that offer was rejected, so don't offer anything less than $750,000.
Mr. Berger ended up purchasing the Smith apartments for $825,000. In cross-examination, Mr. Smith's attorney, Mike Phillips, brought up the issue of Mr. Berger's disclosure to Gura regarding his conflict of interest. Mr. Berger said of the matter,
We definitely had conversations within the firm because I think I had already made an offer on the apartments before acquiring Scott Magliari's interest.
Mr. Phillips, looking for clarification, asked if it had anything to do with the Section 8 tenants that were renting units at the Smith apartments. Mr. Berger said,
It did, and so you can't be the auditor and have Section 8 tenants.
Mr. Phillips was seeking further clarification of how Mr. Berger had handled the situation. Berger explained,
No, well, I don't know if anyone told me to, but we had to remove all the Section 8 tenants, and we did.
Mr. Phillips brought up the sale of the property and asked if Mr. Berger was surprised Mr. Wong had owned the property, and if he was surprised when he delivered the warranty deed, as promised. Mr. Berger said,
Well, my recollection of the whole process is Vic Regis said, Here's Mark Smith's apartments available. We went through the bidding process. Okay, your offer of $825 is accepted, and Glenn Wong's name never came up.
Mr. Phillips asked rhetorically if the name of the apartments were Glenn Wong Apartments, and Mr. Berger answered,
If somebody said these are the Mark Smith apartments, I would assume they belong to Mark Smith.
Mr. Phillips asked if Mr. Berger had ever dealt or even met Mr. Smith. Mr. Berger said that he had not. Mr. Phillips asked,
Did you ever think he played you?
referring to the realtor Vic Regis. Mr. Berger said,
No, I would be surprised.
Mr. Phillips asked Mr. Berger if anyone had mentioned to him that being a contractor of Gura and then becoming a Section 8 landlord, he had a potential conflict of interest. Mr. Berger said,
Actually, nobody needed to mention that to me. I knew that I could not be an owner of Section 8 property and do the audit.
Mr. Phillips asked Mr. Berger if he was aware that a waiver application was sent to HUD. Mr. Berger, puzzled, asked,
I don't think I'm aware of that. What would the waiver be for?
Mr. Phillips told him it was for the Section 8 tenants in the Smith apartment units. Mr. Berger said,
I did not ask for any waiver. I'm not aware of any waiver application.
Mr. Berger explained to Mr. Phillips,
Because I think that between Carvin and myself and Mr. Magliari, we were all very clear that you cannot own Section 8 property and be the auditor for Gura. So we had to take precautions within our own firm, such as me having nothing to do with the audit and making all the Section 8 tenants get out.
Mr. Phillips asked Mr. Berger if he had received checks from Glenn Wong for Section 8 tenant rent. Mr. Berger said,
I have a spreadsheet that tracks the various transactions. That is possible.
Mr. Phillips asked Mr. Berger if he was aware of the rental receipts for the Smith apartment units he had acquired. Mr. Berger said,
I bought the apartments as hopefully something that would provide rental income to my two daughters and the property management collection of rents, handling repairs, whatever. I signed to my wife and daughter because I'm mostly in Saipan, so I was not doing any bank deposits, writing receipts, nothing.
Mr. Phillips presented to the court a check from Mr. Wong for 3 months of rent to Mr. Berger's daughter.
I don't know if that is Section 8 rent or not.
Mr. Berger continued,
I can't say that for sure because there were Section 8 and non-Section 8 tenants, and if they paid Glenn and Glenn paid my daughter, I wouldn't know because I wasn't directly involved in any of that.
Mr. Phillips searched for clarification, asking if that would be improper. Mr. Berger said,
I cannot be a Section 8 landlord and be involved with Gura audit. Cannot.
For Kandit News, I'm Danielle Baza. Thank you and good night.